Hello and welcome once again to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me on the program today. Just a quick reminder, if you have benefited from Just and Sinner as an organization and the educational materials that we produce, we would ask that you would consider becoming a contributor. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means that any gifts you give to us are tax deductible. You can go to justandsinner.org and go to our donate page and help us out there. Well, today on the program, I am privileged to have a discussion with Dr. Robert George, author of a new book of essays called Seeking Truth and Speaking Truth, Law and Morality in Our Cultural Moment. Dr. George is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and the Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He is the author of a number of books, and so we are pleased to have him with us today. So thank you so much, Dr. George, for joining me on the program today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Jordan.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about the context of this book. Now, Seeking Truth and Speaking Truth, Law and Morality in Our Current Cultural Moment. This book, as I was reading through it, I recognize much of what was in this book because these are issues that you've written about in, a number of other contexts. And so what was it that kind of inspired this particular book? As I said, you've addressed a lot of these issues before, but I don't know if I've seen them addressed kind of as maybe systematically as you've done in this particular book.
The book gathers together essays and reflections that I've published over the past decade or so. And this has been something of a wild decade. We've seen the rise of wokeism, the woke movement. Now, it's not as if woke ideology was entirely new. We used to call it political correctness, but it became particularly fierce and extremely militant. And it especially became militant on college and university campuses. And so these are essays that I wrote in many cases to address concerns that I had, that I was worried about my students dealing with, errors that I wanted them to avoid falling into. They address those kinds of topics. And so I thought, well, I should try to share these more broadly. So we put them together in the book, and the real theme, the thing that integrates them all, is the theme of truth-seeking and truth-speaking, hence the title, Seeking Truth and Speaking Truth. And the book has a goal. And the goal is to try to help people in the way that I try to help my students here at Princeton, to form themselves to be determined truth seekers and courageous truth speakers. That's my vocation as a scholar and a teacher. I want to be one of those, a determined truth seeker and a courageous truth speaker. I want to model that for others. I want to persuade others and help form those entrusted to my charge, or those who read my work, to themselves be determined truth seekers and courageous truth speakers. I don't have all the answers. Nobody does. We can never know the truth perfectly. We'll always know it admixed with some amount of error. We'll never know it fully. The truth's too big for that. But we can know truths. And it's important to know the truths that we can know, and to get at much truth as perfectly as we can, knowing that we are frail, fallen, fallible, imperfect human beings.
Yeah, and as much as, these are, separate essays written for various different occasions, it really does feel like a cohesive book. And I think you do see that kind of that theme of truth, along with a lot of other, I think, pretty coherent themes that are kind of threaded throughout these essays. So let's talk about the subject of the soul and human rights. This is at the beginning of the book, and I really think that so much of the current cultural discussions that we're having, or current cultural battles, perhaps, that we are facing at the moment, really come down to this central question of what is a human being. And so many of our political discussions or debates kind of neglect first principles. And what I really like about the work that you've set forth here is that you really start with those first principles and then reason outward, instead of just taking things on a kind of issue by issue basis. And so let's talk about the nature of what a human being actually is. And so perhaps we can maybe begin, as we start talking about our kind of philosophical or theological anthropology, those kinds of questions. We can start with this question of rights. because I think that so much of our discussion in our world is framed around the issue of rights, but we can't really tackle the question of rights without talking about what human nature is. Right? These things are so deeply connected. So let's start with that. First of all, I want to ask you kind of how is it that you think about rights? And I know you outlined some various views of where rights come from and what rights are. So what is it that you claim about rights, and then where do you see culture, the academy, wherever, kind of maybe taking steps in a very different direction?
Rights are what are owed as a matter of justice. That's the basic story about rights. When we're talking about fundamental rights, I'm
Sure.
not talking about things like driver's licenses and things like that. I'm talking about basic civil liberties. I'm talking about the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These fundamental rights. They are the other side. They're what we have when we look at the beneficiary of duties. So if duties are on the one side, the other side of that coin are rights. If I have a duty to you in respect of something, then you have a right. So it's the same thing looked at from the two perspectives. Now, do human beings have fundamental rights? The Declaration of Independence says so. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That statement declares that we do have fundamental rights, and it also says where they come from. We have them not as gifts from the government or as artifacts of law. They come from the hand of God, the creator. Now, how could it be that a creature has rights? Well, the best account I think we can give is that creatures have rights if they are bearers of inherent dignity. And they are bearers of inherent dignity if they have agency. That is, they are rational creatures possessing the freedom to actually determine their actions and thereby determine their character. And the best account I know of how it could be that human beings are bearers of profound, inherent, and equal dignity is Genesis 1, the very first chapter of the very first book of the Bible, where we're told that the human being, unlike other terrestrial creatures, and despite being mortal, made out of material stuff, the Bible says out of the dust of the earth, despite that, the Bible teaches, Genesis 1 teaches, that we're made in the very image and likeness of the divine creator and ruler of all that is, in the very image of God, the imago Dei. Now, what could it mean to say that we are godlike, that we're made in the image of God? Well, it can't mean that God has 5 fingers on each of 2 hands and hair on his head and a nose. So what is it that we have that is like what God has? I think the best account of that is reason and freedom, agency, the ability to understand and act freely, not on compulsion, not by mere instinct or impulse like a brute animal, freely on the basis of our rational grasp of the value of doing things to bring things into being that otherwise would not be in being. So take God in Genesis 1. God envisages states of affairs that do not exist. And then God acts, not in a demiurgic manner, but in a rational way, freely, to bring these things into existence. Whether it's the birds of the air or the fish of the sea or putting the sun in the sky or creating man in his image and likeness. God acts freely for the value of the things that he brings into being. Scripture tells us, and he saw that they were good, right? Remember that part? So he makes something and he saw that it was good. I'll let you in on a little secret. God wasn't surprised to find out it was good. God created the birds of the air and the fish of the sea and man in his very image and likeness and so forth because he knew these were good things to do. Well, we are, of course, not God. God is infinite. We're finite. God is all powerful, all loving. God is perfect. We are very limited, very imperfect. And yet God has chosen to share with us some measure of his divine power, that power to envisage states of affairs that do not exist, to understand the intelligible value, the point of acting to bring them into existence, and then acting, not on mere impulse or instinct like a brute animal, but freely in the way that God acts, on the basis of reasons to bring these states of affairs into existence. And they can be anything. They can be learning. They can be friendship. They can be marriage. We do all sorts of things that brute animals can't do. And we do them freely on the basis of our grasp of the good reasons we have for doing the value of bringing these relationships, things, ideas into being. And in that respect, we are godlike, and as godlike creatures, made in his very image and likeness, we are bearers of profound, inherent, and equal dignity. Hence, our fundamental rights to, among other things, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
So how does this picture that you've presented that contrast with some of the other views about rights that are, commonly taught in our culture, or as I said in the academy? I mean, you interact a bit with Peter Singer, and I know you've done that in some of your other work as well. And maybe he serves as a kind of helpful, alternative to look at to see these different perceptions of rights. So if you could just spend some time talking about the contrast there or some of the other perceptions of rights that people have.
Well, there are various alternatives to the view that I've articulated about rights. And one is to deny that there are such things as fundamental rights. Professor Singer, Peter Singer, is a utilitarian. He's an atheist and something of a materialist, and a utilitarian. He believes that we should make our decisions, that right and wrong are in fact determined by what will conduce to the greatest happiness of the greatest number. That's what the utilitarian position is. Now, as a utilitarian, he does not believe in rights. Right? If there were rights, rights would trump utility. Sometimes you couldn't do things that would maximize overall happiness because doing them would violate somebody's rights. But as a strict, dogmatic utilitarian, he doesn't think anything should trump our obligation to perform the act that will produce the greatest happiness of the greatest number, that will maximize utility. So as a utilitarian, he has to reject the idea that there are fundamental rights. Now, among people who believe in rights, who reject utilitarianism or reject skepticism about rights, the leading alternative to the account I've given was given recently, I believe, if I've understood him correctly, by United States Senator from Virginia, Tim Kaine, who said he thinks the idea that rights come from God is a dangerous idea, and that we should recognize that our rights come from law. They come from government. All right, well, that's a view. It seems to me to be a very poor understanding of rights, a highly inadequate understanding of rights. And it certainly leads to the following conclusion, which strikes me as completely unsatisfactory. And that conclusion is that if the government is our source of rights, if the rights we have are mere gifts of the government, not something above the government to whom the government is accountable, like God, the creator, then the government has the right to take away those rights. The government does no wrong in taking away those rights. If rights are mere gifts of the government gave them, the government can take them away. There's no illegitimacy in the government saying, you know what, we're going to pursue a utilitarian strategy here. Those rights that we formerly recognized, they're no longer operative. We want to do something that would involve contravening those rights or setting those rights aside. Now, that to me is a highly unsatisfactory view, but it's a view. It seems to be Senator Kane's view, and he's an important guy. He was the Democratic vice presidential nominee in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was the presidential nominee. So there are various views. Some people are skeptical about rights. Some people think rights come from government. And then there are people like me and the American founders and the Judeo-Christian tradition who say, no, rights are not mere gifts of any human power, and therefore no merely human power can legitimately take them away. They're gifts from God.
Yeah. And I want to ask a little bit then about maybe some opposition to what would be a more maybe classic liberal view of rights in general that has arisen in a lot of circles in the right at the present moment. Because, we can look at kind of challenges to this conception of rights that we have, shared as a nation on, maybe the ideological left. But right now we are facing, through the rise of post-liberalism, some pretty serious challenges to the way that these topics and subjects have been understood. So with some of the work that I've done, specifically involvement in campus ministry, which has largely been in more kind of conservative intellectual circles, it seems to me that the direction that a lot of that is moving is away from a kind of centralizing of rights, maybe not a denial of rights altogether, but for some, I have seen that. So I'd like to hear your thoughts, because you write a little bit about this in the book as well, about where the right is right now. I'd like to see, especially as a professor at Princeton, I'd like to hear what you're seeing, or if you're seeing these trends where you are there as well, and then maybe how to respond to some of these trends.
I do see these trends. I see them broadly out there. I don't see them strongly represented among our students here at Princeton. I'm not sure why they're not more strongly represented here, because they're pretty prominent. If you look at young people generally on the conservative side of the spectrum, it might be here that the conservative members of the faculty are not inclined toward post-liberalism. I myself am not. Other prominent members of the faculty aren't. So the role models and the teacher, some of the teachers that are influential on campus with conservative students just don't represent that view. But I'm not sure if that fully accounts for why we don't have a stronger representation of the post-liberal view among our conservative students here. In any case, I worry that it reflects a misunderstanding, a buying into the liberal claim that the liberal tradition owns the concept of rights, that we have the concept of rights as a product of liberal political philosophy. And if you buy into that claim on the conservative side, then you're going to be inclined to say, well, then we should abandon rights talk. We should abandon the concept of rights. That's a liberal thing, and we don't want that. Now, the problem is, I think, with that view, is that there really are such a thing as rights. There are moral obligations, duties in justice that people have to other people, that governments have to their people, that represent, from the beneficiary of those duties' point of view, what it makes perfect sense to call rights. Now, liberals might not understand those rights the way conservatives do. They might give a different account of the foundations, the moral foundations of those rights. But the fact that liberals embrace a concept of rights and claim that they invented the concept or that it is their thing should not, in my opinion, lead conservatives to say, well, okay, then we give up the concept of rights. We think that's a liberal thing. We reject it. There really is a right to the free exercise of religion. That's a moral right. Every government owes every person under its authority the respect that we formulate in terms of a right to the free exercise of religion. Every human being is morally entitled to reflect on the great questions of meaning and value, the great questions of human nature, the human good, human dignity, human destiny, and to try to answer those questions as best each of us can by his or her own lights, honestly, not with wishful thinking, not choosing positions because they're going to help us to get ahead or avoid getting us into trouble. But every human being has the right to raise those questions and to reflect on them and try to answer them honestly. And then, within the constraints of the common good, to live with authenticity and integrity, act with authenticity and integrity in light of one's best judgments as to the truth of those great questions. Where did we come from? Where are we going? Is there a more than merely human source of meaning and value, and so forth? Now, that just is what the right to the free exercise of religion most fundamentally is. And it's a moral truth. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with framing it in terms of the right to the free exercise of religion. In fact, that's a very accurate way of formulating it. It's not the only way it could be accurately formulated, but it's an accurate and concise way of formulating it. And I have no intention of yielding the concept of religious freedom to the liberals. In fact, liberals seem to have abandoned it to a very considerable extent. So I think it falls to those of us who are on the conservative side, perhaps especially those of us who are religious conservatives of one stripe or another, to defend religious freedom, the great right to the free exercise of religion. And we can do the same thing with freedom of speech and the freedom to criticize the government or petition the government for redress of grievances, or the rights to due process and to equal protection. The basic civil rights and liberties that historically we Americans have treasured and prided ourselves on recognizing.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that I hear, one of the reasons why I see so many kind of young people falling into post-liberalism, and obviously there are very different forms of post-liberalism, so they're
absolutely, yeah.
But one of the challenges I think that they see in the culture is that people claim rights for all sorts of things, right? And rights become basically demands. If you say, I have a right to X, Y, or Z, you're saying I demand or I deserve X, Y, or Z. And I think what a lot of people feel is that there's really no stopping the kind of train going in that direction, right? Of the kind of increasing multiplication of rights, right? So you start with the right to life, and then you have a right to this and a right to that. And then all of a sudden you have this kind of infinitely multiplying, seemingly list of rights that leads toward a kind of expressive individualism, right? This is the argument that I often hear. So the question is, how do you make sure, or how do you even derive what rights are? Like, how do you know what things are rights and which things are not?
Well, the mainstream of the liberal tradition in its modern form holds that the right and rights are prior to the good. This is the famous formulation, for example, of John Rawls, who's the greatest of the modern or contemporary liberal political philosophers.
Right.
Those of us on the conservative side think that is where the train goes off the tracks. That's the fundamental mistake. In fact, you can't determine principles of justice, including those principles of justice we call rights, human rights, natural rights, without considering the goods that are protected by genuine rights. So actually, Rawls has it backwards. The liberal tradition has it backwards. The good is prior to the right. If you want to figure out what rights people have in a disciplined way, where rights aren't just an expression of desires, and it's just an explosion of rights. Anything I want, I claim to have a right to. If we're going to do this right, if we're going to be rigorous and disciplined in identifying human rights, then we begin by figuring out what are the basic aspects of human well-being and fulfillment, of human flourishing. What are the ends or purposes that give us more than merely instrumental reasons for action, that are constitutive of our well-being as human beings, and as such give us more than merely instrumental reasons for action. And then we have to think about their integral directiveness. And it's from the integral directiveness of the various aspects, various fundamental, non-instrumental aspects of human well-being and fulfillment, that we derive moral norms. including norms of justice like human rights. So that is the answer to the question. This is what prevents rights talk from just being cheap. And you can claim anything as a right, and rights become conversation stoppers.
Sure.
The whole problem with the liberal tradition is that it tries to identify principles of right, including rights, principles of justice, including rights, without adverting to the human goods that rights, if they in fact obtain, protect.
So the question of the good is really the ultimate question, right? That's where we need to begin and extrapolate from the question of what is the good or what is the common good to then the question
Exactly.
of
I mean,
rights.
Aquinas was on this, a millennium ago.
Sure.
Or nearly a millennium. So, his basic idea is this: all moral reflection begins by our grasp of first principles of practical reason. What are the first principles of practical reason? Well, they direct our choosing an action toward what is inherently and intelligibly fulfilling of human beings constituted with the natures that we
Yeah.
have. That is, we're biological, we're organisms, we're animals, but we're rational, and we're relational, and we're spiritual. So there's a
Yeah.
diverse range of respects in which we can flourish or fail to flourish, corresponding to the complex dimensions of our human nature. And the first principles of our action, the first principles of our practical thinking, of our reasoning toward acting, are the foundational principles of moral reflection, including reflection in the domain of political morality.
So as we're talking about this idea of the good or the common good, something that I have sometimes seen, and this is a trend among I see it with some young men, particularly very traditionalist Roman Catholics who probably wish Vatican II did not happen, but can't quite say that. That sometimes I hear discussions about the common good where it seems to me as if the common good is almost arbitrarily determined. And people then speak about a common good conservatism, but then the common good is just defined by whatever it is that they in particular see as the common good. So I see, for example, this among some of these, as I said, young, very traditionalist Roman Catholics. They perceive of, well, entrance into the Roman Church in obedience to the teachings of the magisterium as a good, not just a spiritual, but also a temporal good, who therefore argue for a very strong kind of integralism, where there is kind of some kind of establishment, and this takes different forms depending on who you're talking to, of the Roman Church as the kind of official religion of the United States. And this is ultimately the goal. And the argument is, well, that's the common good because this is good both for spiritual and temporal well-being. So if we're speaking about the common good in the civic sphere, how do we come to a conclusion about what that is? When you have
Well,
these
it's by
very
reflecting on the goods that human beings have in common, which are the range of aspects of human well-being, but correspond to the range of aspects of human well-being and fulfillment, and then to reflect on how those goods can be pursued by common action. Okay? And when we think about that, we see that there's a very complex common good. It's served in part by government, but not exclusively by government. And there are aspects of it that the government needs to stay out of so that the institutions of civil society, beginning with the family, assisted by the church and other religious organizations and all manner of private, civic, and other forms of association, serve the good of all. They serve the goods that we have in common by organizing our behavior so that we're cooperating in the pursuit of those goods, thus realizing those goods more fully, more fairly, and so forth. Okay, so that's the basic story. So among the sorts of reflections that have to go on are reflections about, well, what about the good of religion?
right.
Is that purely private? Well, I mean, my answer is no, it's not purely private. But does that mean that the state should establish a church? Well, no, I don't think so either. I think establishments, while not in principle as a matter of absolute morality ruled out, I wouldn't want to take that view, but they're certainly not morally required. And especially in circumstances of pluralism, it would be very destructive. It would be a bad thing to establish a church or a particular faith as the religion of the state. It would be bad for the state, be probably especially bad for the church. The history of religious establishment shows that religious establishments in general are not great for the church. I mean, look at the Church of England, for example, or the Church of Sweden. So it's a complicated business. Sometimes our choices are not between morally permissible and morally impermissible options, but are choices rather among morally permissible but mutually exclusive sorts of options. So, different societies can be reasonably, morally uprightly organized in a variety of different ways, although there are some things that no society can rightly do, like violate people's fundamental rights, for example, like the fundamental rights of unborn children, or black people, in the period of slavery and so forth and so on. So there are limits. It's not just relativism, but all societies don't have to look alike. The common good can be pursued in different ways by different societies, and it will have to be pursued in different ways sometimes because the circumstances, the history, the tradition, the sociology, just the facts on the ground, the current challenges are going to be different from society to society. So there's no template for forming the perfect society with the perfect common good. That's just the wrong way of looking at things. There is no such thing as that. You're just approaching the question wrong if that's your goal. But all of the human goods can be pursued in a cooperative way. And I do think that common good constitutionalists, to use the term introduced, at least in my reading by my friend Adrian Vermeule at Harvard, I think common good constitutionalism is right to suppose that religion, like every other human good, is among the human goods that government should be concerned about because it is legitimately concerned about it. In the document Dignitatis Humanae of the Second Vatican Council, the document in which the Church declares itself on the side of a robust view of religious freedom, there is the statement that the government should foster the religious life, favor and foster, I think are the exact words, favor and foster the religious life of the people. I think that's right. But now how do you do that? I mean, one fundamental way you do it is by respecting people's religious freedom, their ability to raise the great questions, to answer them honestly, and to live with authenticity and integrity in light of their best answers. You do not foster the good of religion by imposing religion on people because faith is by nature free. If a forced faith, a coerced faith, is no faith at all. I mean, everybody understands that. I mean, you can force people to, you can require people, you can use the force of law, you can coerce people to perform the outward acts of religion that go along with authentic faith, but you can't actually coerce the authentic faith. You can coerce people to go to church. You can coerce people to, say the rosary. You can coerce people to, pray 5 times a day facing Mecca. You can pray. You can force people to do those things. What you can't reach with law or any form of coercion are the interior acts of intellect and will that are the substance of genuine faith. And governments need to keep that in mind when following the advice of the Second Vatican Council, as they should, to favor and foster the spiritual life, the religious life of the people.
And just one final question on this, because these are just questions that I often am asked. And so one of these questions is, well, okay, hear this talk about religious freedom and rights, but this doesn't seem to be how Christians spoke prior to the modern era. And so the argument is going to be that someone like a Thomas Aquinas does not really support this modern notion of rights. So I often get the question, where does the classical tradition speak about rights? I mean, you see this, language show up on occasion, but it's not as prominent of a theme, especially related to religious freedom. Now, I know you have a very helpful section in this book on this exact issue in terms of the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church on these issues. But how do you respond to that claim that this is some kind of a novelty, that it's not consistent with the classical or Thomistic tradition?
Well, I mean, if you go back to the church fathers, you go back to figures like Augustine, or you look at Aquinas, there are duties in justice, right? They're identified as a particular species of moral duty, duties that we owe to each
Right.
other or that the polis owes to the citizen or what have you in justice. And that means they're beneficiaries of those duties. And all rights are is a word for the word having the right or a right or having rights. Those are words for the the benefit conferred on the beneficiary
Right.
by respect for the principle of justice. So there's nothing fundamentally new here. Jargon changes, words changes. Although there are really words corresponding to the concept of rights going even back into pre-Christian antique philosophy. If you look at the writings of Plato and Aristotle. Now, if your concept of rights is, say, Lockean, John Locke, or
Right. Yep.
Rawlsian, yeah, you're not going to find that in antiquity, but that's not what I'm
Right.
defending either. And it's not what the Catholic Church or the modern Christian tradition is defending either.
Yeah, and I think
Some people fear, Jordan, I should add one point. Some
yeah,
people
please.
fear that if we use the language of rights at all, the philosopher Joan Lockwood O'Donovan is an example of this. Professor O'Donovan thinks, she's afraid if you use the concept of rights at all, if you buy into that, you're immediately buying into a kind of individualism which is incompatible
Yep.
with authentic Christian faith, which is just not individualistic. Now, I agree that authentic Christian faith is not individualistic, but we do honor the rights of the person. We come as persons, as individuals. Now, we're individuals whose fulfillment inherently requires entering into relationships that are of a more than purely instrumental type with friends, with spouses, with children, with parents, and so forth and so on. I don't think we should be so worried about the kind of radical individualism, the expressive individualism. You used that term earlier that Robert Bellow, the great sociologist, introduced into the discourse. I don't think we should be so concerned about them. They're a legitimate concern. We don't want to fall into expressive individualism or any kind of radical form of individualism, but we shouldn't be so concerned that we throw the concept of rights overboard. We're going to need something to refer to what you've got, where you stand, when somebody, another person, the government, owes you a duty as a matter of justice.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's very helpful. And we just, as human beings, we have this tendency to overreact to things, right? We see one error, and so we tend to jump over, I
Yeah,
think, to the other error.
yeah.
That's just what we do. And so I think we're seeing the fruits of this expressive individualism. I do think that that term is very helpful. Um, and so we want to just kind of jump in the other direction. But I mean, I think when you look at the pagan pre-Christian world as compared to the early Christian world, it's really undoubted that there is a value of the individual that is present there and elevated that you don't see within the ancient world.
Exactly right. I mean, I yield to no one in my regard for the great philosophers of antiquity, Greek and Rome, Plato, Socrates, his of course Plato's teacher,
Mhm.
master, Aristotle, Plato's student, Cicero. I think there's great wisdom in their teachings. I, as you know, because you've read some of my work, rely on them in many ways. I teach them to my students. I assign their writings to my students. I think we have not mined deeply enough the wisdom of the ancient philosophers. So I yield to no one in my esteem for the philosophers of antiquity. And yet it must be said that none of them, even the greatest among them, ever reaches that great Hebraic insight, which is the principle, the foundational principle of all sound morality. That is the principle of the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. We have because we are creatures made in the very image and likeness of God. That Hebraic insight is so fundamental to our concept of the dignity of the person,
Right.
to the idea that the person must be treated as a subject, not as an object, as a person, not as a thing, as an
Yep.
end, and never as a means only or a mere instrument. Now, we haven't always been great in Christendom at living up to that principle. It has, been transgressed in so many ways. Today, the great evil of abortion transgresses it.
Absolutely.
Racial injustice, especially slavery, transgressed it. We've not done a great job of living up to it. But that doesn't mean it's not right and true. It is right and true.
Yeah.
And it is a distinctive contribution of the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's a Hebrew insight that has been spread to the world by Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And that's all very helpful. I want to move now to another topic, and I know there's so many things to talk about because this book covers so much, and I know we're just covering a couple kind of major areas here. But the other thing I really want to touch on is education, because you have been a proponent of ideological neutrality in educational institutions. And I think, again, I see this as a reaction to where our culture currently is, that so many educational institutions have become so hostile to those with conservative views, whether that's in morals or politics or theology, whatever it might be, that many see a religious institution or some other kind of specifically ideological college as really the only option for those who have more conservative values. And I see this in my work with students who have really struggled personally at institutions where their views are so horribly maligned by professors as well as by other students, and sometimes professors and students in consorts directly towards students.
Bullying, I see it myself.
It
I know
is.
what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I know you said in this book that you felt like you've had a bit of freedom in your own position at Princeton, which is of course a wonderful thing, that you do have the freedom to express your views and teach as you do. But I just want to ask about the idea of neutrality as a whole, because again, an argument that I often hear is that there really is no such thing as an ideologically neutral institution, and one way or another, any university or institution of education is going to be captured by one kind of ideology or another. So why do you think, in light of that common critique, why do you think that neutrality is important and beneficial?
Okay. This turns out to be a complicated business, but let me try my best to explain.
It's a lot.
Now, I've made a career out of being a critic of the idea that law and policy in any nation can be neutral with respect to questions of what makes for or detracts from a valuable and morally worthy way of life.
Mm-hmm.
Any polity is going to have to make decisions about what its law will be, what its policies will be, which will reflect controversial judgments about the human good and its directiveness. I mean, there's just no way around that. A lot of my work has been criticizing John Rawls's spectacular, but I think failed effort to try to create a set of principles that would actually work to enable societies to, in their governance, be neutral on fundamental questions of the human good. So when we talk about neutrality in universities or in non-sectarian universities, which is something, for reasons I'll articulate in a moment, I do favor, we're not talking about the neutrality I was criticizing in the work of figures like John Rawls and other modern liberal political philosophers. Now, when it comes to universities, whether you are private or public, religiously affiliated or non-sectarian, your telos, your purpose, your aim, your defining goal is to pursue the truth. It's to get at the truth of things. It's to advance and deepen our knowledge of things. That means getting at the truth, more deeply understanding the truth, clearing away as many errors as we can. Now, we're never going to get fully there, as I said earlier. We're always going to have some false beliefs that mixed with whatever truth we are able to attain. But this is the goal of the university. It's the goal of students. It's the goal of faculty members, or should be. The purpose of universities is not to get people great jobs at Morgan Stanley. That's a purpose. It's a secondary purpose. It's a legitimate purpose. But that's not fundamentally what justifies universities, liberal arts universities at least, existing. And the goal is not to effectuate social change. So the social justice vision of the university is all wrong too. Universities are truth-seeking institutions if they are being faithful to their defining mission. Now, how do we do that? We pursue truth in university settings in many different ways. And on these issues that I'm about to describe, I'm a pluralist. I'm happy that we have private universities like Princeton or Notre Dame or Brigham Young or Emory, but I'm also happy that we have public universities like the University of Florida and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Rutgers here in New Jersey. And I'm happy that we have religiously affiliated universities like Notre Dame and Wheaton and Baylor and Brigham Young and Yeshiva and Zaytuna out in California, the Muslim liberal arts college. I'm glad that we have religiously affiliated ones. And I'm also glad that we have non-sectarian ones. All of our public universities, University of Michigan, University of California at Berkeley, University of Nevada, University of Utah, they're non-sectarian. They're required to be non-sectarian. But we also have non-sectarian private universities, some of which began as non-sectarian universities, University of Pennsylvania, some of which began as religiously affiliated universities and then later dropped their religious affiliation and became non-sectarian. Princeton, where I teach, is an example of that. So as a pluralist, I am happy that we have all these different sorts of universities. Now, religiously affiliated universities have a dual mission. They're related, the two missions. They're not distinct, but there are two. One is the general pursuit of truth. The other is the propagation of the faith, right? The transmission of the faith. We pursue truth in the context of a shared commitment to the faith. Those universities cannot be neutral in the way that I want non-sectarian universities to be, and I'll describe that way in another moment. They cannot be neutral. Notre Dame cannot be neutral on great moral questions. Yeshiva cannot be neutral on moral and religious questions. Brigham Young can't be. Wheaton College can't be. They are pre-committed to fulfill part of their mandate. They've got to be committed to certain values that are rejected by some other people, reasonable people of goodwill who don't share the faith. Okay? Now, what about institutions that are non-sectarian like Princeton? They don't have that second mandate, the propagation of a faith. They are simply dedicated to pursuing truth. And they do it best by exposing their students to the best that has been thought and said across the ideological, political, religious, cultural spectrum on the most important questions to be addressed across the arts and sciences and in the learned professions. That's why I think private non-sectarian universities, as well as public universities, should adopt strict principles of institutional neutrality. They should adopt the University of Chicago free speech principles. So anybody can advocate any position so long as they're doing it in the proper currency of intellectual discourse, giving reasons, providing evidence, making arguments that other people can assess, criticize, and engage with. And I think these universities should adopt the University of Chicago's Calvin report. That is the report that enunciates the principles of neutrality. Now, what do we mean by neutrality? No university should be or could be neutral on everything. By definition, any university cannot be neutral on whether we should pursue the truth or prefer truth to error or live with convenient lies rather than know the inconvenient truth. No university can be neutral on questions of academic honesty and integrity, whether we're talking about students on examinations or faculty in their published scholarship. Plagiarism by faculty and students alike, we're not neutral about that, and we can't be neutral about that. We have a non-neutral moral position. But when it comes to great questions of politics, religion, culture, on which reasonable people disagree. It is, in my view, the mission of non-sectarian universities to do what I said a moment ago: expose their students, have their faculty engage with the best that has been thought and said across the spectrum of viewpoints, without the university putting a thumb on the scale to favor one view over another, making some of its students insiders, some of its students outsiders, some of its faculty orthodox, and some of its faculty heretical. So the rules that apply, or should apply in my view, in a non-sectarian university are in some ways different from those applying in religiously affiliated universities. Now, there are also lots of rules and norms and principles that are common across the board to universities qua universities. I think religiously affiliated universities and non-sectarian universities are more alike than unlike, and they share norms and principles 90% of the way. The difference is at the margins, but the margins matter. These differences matter. I don't want anybody to be thrown out of Princeton for disagreeing with me about abortion.
Right.
What would be more likely is I would be thrown out of Princeton
Yes.
for disagreeing with the majority of my colleagues about abortion. Now, Notre Dame or Baylor or Wheaton, it's a different situation. If part of the doctrine that's meant to be propagated is the pro-life position, which I think it is for those institutions, Notre Dame, I hope the same is true of Wheaton, I know it's true of Notre Dame, understands itself to be a pro-life university, a Catholic university, and as such committed to, among other things, the pro-life cause. So if Notre Dame says we don't want to host a pro-choice group or fund a pro-abortion group on our campus, that's fine with me. But I would have a different stance toward that in a non-sectarian university, because I'm a pluralist and think that there are ways to pursue the truth that are good and valuable in the non-sectarian context, and there are ways to pursue the truth that are different at the margins, but good and valuable in religiously affiliated universities. So yes, strict Calvin report neutrality for non-sectarian universities, private or public, but it would be totally inappropriate to have Calvin neutrality principles at religiously affiliated universities.
So
can I raise one more point? I've been
No, please.
lecturing
Yeah,
here, which
go
I
ahead.
shouldn't be doing, but one more point. So someone might say, more than one someone has said to me in the past, oh, okay, all right. But if that's your view, then couldn't an institution like, let's say, Yale or Princeton, or the University of Virginia, declare itself to be a kind of sectarian institution, but devoted not to a religion, but to liberal secularism? And then wouldn't they be entitled to exclude certain points of view or disfavor certain points of view on controversial questions, the way you think Notre Dame and Yeshiva and Brigham Young and Wheaton are entitled to? My answer to that is yes, they could do that. They could do that. But I would insist on what we have with Brigham Young and Yeshiva and Notre Dame and Wheaton, and that is truth in advertising.
Yes.
If you are officially committed to liberal secularism, the way Notre Dame is committed to Catholicism and Wheaton to evangelical Protestantism and Yeshiva to Judaism, if you're really committed to the liberal secularism as your religion or pseudo-religion, then fine, so long as you advertise it and make clear to parents and students that they're coming to a sectarian university to learn a pseudo-religious doctrine.
Sure.
And we'll see how that goes for them. Of course, they're not going to do that. They won't do that because they advertise themselves as not religious, as not imposing any particular dogma or propagating any particular faith. So which is it? You guys are just going to have to live up to your own publicity.
Yeah. So we have seen a number of universities take stronger or more explicit stances on neutrality in a number of ways because of pressure in the last few years.
Yeah.
But while I've seen that happening, at the same time, the same universities that maybe have a broader principle of neutrality and professors can teach according to their views on this or that, the number of professors that are conservatives is still really small. And
it is.
so the university still ends up, even if those conservative professors say are free to say what they say and teach what they want to teach, it still leads to an education where 90+% of a student's education is going to be coming from a more progressive standpoint. So how do we deal with that? I mean, what do you foresee as resolving this issue? And there's obviously no easy solution to this issue, but what do you see as kind of steps to take, or are there even steps to take to try to make, again, not just policies of neutrality, but actually have these universities have professors that do actually share conservative views?
Yes, there are steps that we should take, and in some places we are taking them, and I think that's great.
Yeah.
So, what's the problem? The problem is we've got intellectual and ideological monocultures in our universities, especially in our most prestigious and influential universities.
Yep.
Some of them, Harvard, for example, has only 3% of the faculty who identify as conservative in any way, and 90% who are on the left side. One way, at some point, further, on the left side of the spectrum, from center left to radical left, and various kinds of radical left. Well, that's an impediment to. It's not just that it's unfair to conservatives. It can only arise with a lot of unfairness to conservatives. But lay aside the unfairness to conservatives. It's bad for education, because it means we're not going to be doing a good job at exposing students to the best that has been taught and said, or is to be taught and said, on competing sides of issues. So we have a problem with the lack of viewpoint diversity in most universities, especially elite universities. The solution is diversify the faculty ideologically. How do you do that? Well, I think it's not with a program of affirmative action for conservatives. You begin by stopping the discrimination and having university leaders who recognize we've got a problem. The problem until recently is that the secondary problem is you haven't recognized the primary problem. Yeah. And universities, and university leaders deny that we ever had a problem. Well, now we've got some good news. University leaders at places like Washington University and Vanderbilt, Wesleyan University in Connecticut, many of whom are themselves liberals, are saying, we've got a problem. Our problem is we're ideological monocultures, echo chambers, and it's damaging our educational mission. Okay, great first step. Now you go about solving it. First step there, stop discriminating against conservatives, and have university leaders who put an end to it, who look for it, and when they find it, they come down hard on the people who are discriminating, and they ensure that fair consideration is given to conservative candidates for academic positions at all levels, from entry-level positions all the way to senior professorships. I think an important step is building infrastructure where there is genuine ideological diversity within existing universities. My program at Princeton, the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions, was a pioneer of doing that. Yeah. So this program models for other universities, and we've been copied now by universities all over the country, of genuine viewpoint diversity, bringing about the much more serious and extensive engagement of ideas across ideological lines, leading to the better education, the benefit of our students, and to our faculty, who are better scholars because they're having to engage with people who disagree with them. Whether on the right or the left, they're going to have to engage with people who disagree with them. Much larger programs than the Madison program, programs on a much larger scale, but modeled on the basic idea of the Madison program, have now been built at Arizona State University, University of Texas at Austin, University of Florida, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Tennessee, University of Tennessee, the Ohio State University. Michigan has announced that the University of Michigan has announced that it's going to build one. One has just opened in South Carolina this past week at the University of South Carolina. So those are really good news. And then the final thing, and I know we have to conclude this discussion, but just if I have another moment, please. Final thing I would highlight here is the need to attend to the roots of the problem, or among the roots of the problem we find, and that's in credentialing for academic positions and in accreditation of universities. So many of the institutions that play outsized roles in credentialing people who will be on the stage in American higher education. These are institutions that are off the stage that nobody sees or knows about unless you're in academia itself. And they become monocultures. And so efforts have to be made to diversify thinking within those entities, great professional associations, academic academies, the American Association of University Professors, and so forth. And then the accreditation cartel that now exists. Universities have to be accredited in order to receive to be eligible for federal funding for themselves and for their students. The accreditors have become themselves an ideological monoculture. The cartel that they have, their 8 regional accreditors, basically is what it comes down to, has got to be broken. And so we need to build new accreditors. The current administration in Washington, D.C. says they are ready, willing, and eager to certify new accreditors. It's important that those accreditors be built and that universities that do want to reform will have an alternative to the cartel for accreditation.
What are the, and I know we've got to end here, but, and you obviously don't know the answer to this question, but just, are you hopeful about the future? Do you foresee this changing just in the direction you see things going at the current moment?
Well, I'm always hopeful. Hope's a virtue. It's a required virtue for Christians. We're not allowed to give up hope. And hope is not mere optimism. I mean, optimism, as the late Richard John Newhouse used to say, is a matter of optics. It's a passive thing. It's, what you think's going to happen. Hope is an active thing because it's a virtue. It's one of the great theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. If you're hopeful, you're going to act to try to make things better, to try to make things happen that should be happening. But let me say, I'm not only hopeful at this particular moment, I am, as it happens, for what it's worth, optimistic. Because when I see what's being built at the institutions I mentioned around the country, and not just there, but programs like our Madison program at other private universities, including leading elite influential universities like University of Chicago, University of Pennsylvania, the program in human flourishing at Harvard, the program at Johns Hopkins University, and so forth. I can't help but be optimistic. So this is a good moment. It's a hopeful moment. It's a moment that I think we have a very good chance of looking back on and saying this is when the reform began to happen. And with that, I think we've concluded our time.
Yeah, well, that's a great positive note to end on. So once again, the book is Seeking Truth and Speaking Truth, Law and Morality in Our Cultural Moment. So if you'd like to pick this up, I'll post a link below. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Jordan. It's my pleasure.